Sometimes in 2D games or games with a third person point of view, attaching the audio listener to either the player or the camera can both sound wrong, since the perspective just doesn't feel right. We'll talk about how to attach the audio listener to specific cameras, but also how to offset it so that it sits somewhere in between the camera and the player character. We're going to take a look at this in the meadow area of the demonstration level. So we'll just play from here. So in the demonstration level, we have the first person camera that we're in at the moment. We have a third person camera using the key T. And we have a free camera from the key F. We also have a 2D section over here that we'll be looking at in a few minutes. All of this is controlled within the first person character blueprint. So we'll search our content browser and open that up. If we look in the viewport, you can see that we've got a number of cameras here. And we've also got some scene components here and here that we're going to use to attach the audio listener to. By default, the audio listener is attached to the active camera. So if we simply make a camera active and make all the other cameras inactive, then we'll hear things from the active camera's perspective. So the key F that switches to the free camera here executes this custom event, and we set the free camera to be active. So that's a reference to our free camera component in the viewport, which is there. And we'll make the first person camera inactive. For testing purposes, we've also allowed the player to toggle back to the first person camera position. So over here, using the L key, we're using that set audio listener override node that we looked at in the last video to toggle back and forth between listening from the free camera's position or the first person camera's position. Let's just have a look at that. So here we are in the meadow, we're in the first person, and that's the active camera. I'm going to press F, so that's now switched the first person camera to inactive, and our free cam is now active. So we're listening from this perspective. If I press L, we'll toggle back to the first person with the set audio listener override. You can see now we're hearing things from the perspective of the player character and that first person camera over here back in the meadow. Keyboard key T executes our switch to third person custom event here. And again, we've got a third person camera component that we're just getting a reference to here, and we're setting that to be active and switching off the others. And with the third person camera, we're also unhiding the player character. Now this time we've used the set audio listener override to actually attach the listener position to this scene component rather than the camera itself. For the third person listening mode, if we kept the listener position attached to the player, then the perspective on the sound wouldn't feel right. But if we simply attach the listener to the camera, then some other issues can arise. So in the level, let's just have a listen to what would happen if the listener position was set to the third person camera. So I'll press T. Okay, so our audio listener position is now on this camera. And over here, there's a little campfire. Now, my player is right up against that campfire, but because the listener position is in the camera, I can't actually hear it. So that seems a bit strange. And now my player is away from the campfire, but as the camera comes closer, we're hearing it from the camera's perspective. Given these issues, it's not always appropriate to place the audio listener in the same position as the camera. And so often we go for some kind of compromise position, somewhere on a line between the camera and the player character. So our third person camera here is actually a child of this component called a spring arm. And what this does is it tries to maintain its children at a fixed distance from the parent. But if there's a collision, then it will retract or pull in the children before springing back. This is used to stop the player character being obscured by objects in the level that might get between the camera and the player. This is a common approach, but it can create some unwelcome effects from an audio perspective, with some sudden movements of the listener position. So let's demonstrate that. We'll go to our third person again. And our listener is currently on the camera. So as we come here, you can hear that fire, but you see that sudden change in perspective there. That's because the rock comes between the camera and the player, and so the spring arm pulls the camera in to the player so that it's not obscured. But obviously what we get at that moment is a sudden jump in listener position. So you'll need to work closely with the rest of the team to establish some kind of compromise with regards to the lag or the speed at which the spring arm operates. In order to have some control over this third person listener position so that it's not either fixed on the player or fixed on the camera, we've added this Boolean here, adjustable listener position, and this float value, percentage towards camera. So if we look over here, we can see how that's working. If we're in third person mode and the adjustable listener position Boolean is true, then what we do is we get the spring arm origin location, which in this case is near to the player, and the third person camera location, where the camera currently is on the other end of the spring arm. Then we use the percentage towards camera to multiply this vector length, and so effectively move the third person listener position along that line between the spring arm origin and the camera. So if we enable that Boolean here, and our percentage towards camera is set to 0.38, which in this instance feels about right, then we can hear the effect that has in game. So I'll switch to third person again and then approach that campfire. And this time we won't get those two extremes of being right up against the campfire but not hearing it, or simply hearing it from the camera's perspective and not the player's. We've taken a similar approach to our 2D section here. So we've set the other cameras to be inactive, the 2D camera to be active. We've got a scene component called 2D listener position. And in our viewport, you can see here that that is a child of this spring arm. This time the listener remains at this fixed distance between the camera and the player, so that we don't get the extremes of perhaps listening from the camera and not actually hearing things because of our distance, or listening from the player's perspective and then having the sounds whip too quickly from right to left as the player moves past objects. So here in this particular corner of the meadow, we've got these fences and they lead to our 2D section. So as we go through this trigger point here, we switch to that 2D camera. And our listener position is fixed at that distance about midway between the two things. We've just put that cone in there to indicate the position of the bird. And you can experiment yourself with moving that listener component to see how, when you put it too close to the player, we can sometimes get too quick a movement in the sound. And if we put it too close to the camera, then sometimes we can have the situation where we don't actually hear the sound at all because we're outside of its attenuation fall-off distance. What feels right in terms of an audio listener position will really depend on the nature of your game. We've looked at a range of different options, from attaching the audio listener position to a specific camera, as is the case with the free camera, to offsetting it to a position between the player and the camera, which is what we've done for both the third person perspective and for the 2D section.